Right, so now onto the female reproductive system. And so here we're seeing the parts of the female system. We can see here how the bladder is located under under the uterus. And we're seeing here then the uterine tube or the fallopian tube is the one that would transport the egg cell and the sperm cells. At the end of the uterine tube are these finger-like structures called the fimbriae. And so the fimbriae are holding on to the ovary. See here. Then another part, the cervix. Cervix know that this is the end part of the uterus. And the fornix is the part that is the extension towards the end there, the back. And we're seeing how the vagina and the urethra are actually different canals. The clitoris here is this purple looking part. And so then we have this inner flap region and the outer flap region, labium minus, labium majus. If you call these labia minora versus labia majora, that would also be correct. So you would see that on the other lab pictures that I put up for you guys. Labia majora. Then on this picture, we're seeing ligaments that are holding these organs in place. Suspensory ligament is suspending the ovaries from the top. The broad ligament is this big, large ligament there, holding it on the sides. And you can see it also, that whole white part. Ovarian ligament is between the ovary and the uterus. And the round ligament connects to the front. Okay, so now let's talk about oogenesis, or the process of egg cell formation. So beginning at puberty, a woman has primary oocytes. Now, before they're born, it used to be oogonia, but then after the baby is born, the baby girl is born, the oogonia turn into the primary oocytes. Now, at puberty, and then each month after that, the primary oocytes continue meiosis 1. So before they were stuck in meiosis 1. But then at puberty each month, a few of these oocytes are selected to go through this. When a primary oocyte finishes meiosis 1, now here this is a little bit different than in the male. You still form two cells, but one cell is larger. The larger one is the secondary oocyte, and then a small first polar body. This first polar body has nothing to do with the egg cell. It's only going to be that secondary oocyte that will get fertilized. The secondary oocyte, then it says, is the future ovum or the egg cell, which may be fertilized by a sperm cell in the future. Then, after fertilization, secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2. Then you get a second polar body and a zygote, or a fertilized egg. And so just to kind of summarize this, primary oocyte, each month during menstruation, it goes through meiosis 1. Then you get a secondary oocyte that will come out of the ovary and wait for fertilization, and a smaller cell called the first polar body. Then, if it is fertilized, I'll write here, if fertilized, then the secondary oocyte finishes meiosis 2. Okay, if there's no fertilization, it does not go through meiosis 2, and then the secondary oocyte was just going to degenerate and get expelled from the body through menstruation. Okay, but if it is fertilized here, first it would actually be called the ovum, and then when the egg and the sperm cells nuclei meet, meaning their DNA meet, then it's going to be called a zygote. The other cell that is produced is the second polar body. And again, the polar bodies have nothing to do with the egg cell or to form any part of the baby. They're just going to degenerate. So that's what we're seeing on this picture, kind of what I try to draw for you guys. Primary oocyte goes through first meiotic division. You get a secondary oocyte and a first polar body. Then only if it's fertilized, then you get the second meiosis division. And then you get the ovum, zygote, and the second polar body. Okay, so these egg cells are actually inside structures called follicles. Follicles basically have the egg cell and then a few surrounding cells around them. At puberty, the anterior pituitary gland releases FSH. FSH stands for the follicle stimulating hormone. So basically, FSH is stimulating these follicles to grow. So with each reproductive cycle, some of the small primordial follicles, so in the ovaries, there are many of these primordial follicles, but so some of these mature into the primary follicles. Then only one of these follicles, or it could be more than one, but usually one primary oocyte is selected to resume meiosis 1. So the primary oocyte enlarges, and the primary follicle then turns into a secondary follicle. Okay, so this is showing the succession of these follicles. So there are many of these primordial follicles. And so one or a few of these primordial follicles may be selected. So then they're going to get larger because of FSH. Primary follicle then is going to get larger and form a secondary follicle. Again, FSH is causing it to get larger. And we can see here how the secondary follicle is starting at these fluid-filled spaces. Then the secondary follicle grows even larger to form a Graafian follicle, or the mature follicle. This inside fluid-filled space is called an antrum. We're going to see that in a little bit. Okay, so then this fluid-filled space, the pressure builds up, and then finally it's going to pop. So here the egg cell, or the oocyte, comes out of the ovary, and that's called ovulation. So we're going to see that causing ovulation is done by LH and estrogen. Now the cells that used to surround the oocyte, they leave behind, they stay behind, and now it's going to be called the corpus luteum. Okay, so we're going to learn that the corpus luteum is important because it releases estrogen and progesterone. These two hormones keep the inner lining of the uterine or the uterus intact. And this inner lining is called the endometrium. If there is no fertilization, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate. When it dies, when it degenerates, it no longer releases estrogen and progesterone, and then the inner lining of the endometrium gets shed, which is menstruation. So here we're just seeing the follicles here. They're showing the small primordial follicles, the primary follicles, and the large one there. While a follicle is developing, getting larger, the cells that surround the oocyte get into these layers. I'm actually not going to ask you these different layers of the follicles. Don't worry about that. But I did mention the mature Graafian follicle, so this is the follicle right before ovulation, and it contains that large cavity called the antrum. And here we're seeing the mature antral follicle again, or the Graafian follicle. Ovulation, when the egg cell comes out of the ovary, this is caused by LH and estrogen, as I wrote down. So LH and estrogen levels increase at about day 14, which is the mid-cycle. So then LH and estrogen cause meiosis 1 to get completed and for ovulation to occur. Okay, so put a big star here on this slide. You're going to see questions on this. What LH and estrogen cause. And so here we're seeing the secondary oocyte getting ovulated, and the oocyte is going to wait around here to see if sperm cells come. So it's going to be waiting for the sperm cells. Ovulation is going to occur in the fallopian tubes, but in the region that is closest to the ovary, because the oocyte cannot live for very long in the fallopian tube.